you know that the Gustav Lutzers celebrated 76 years of marriage. They just live about 6, 7 houses down the street here on Broadway. But I think 4 of the kids are here today. Oh boy, that's not a good term to use for old people like Albert. Harold and Albert and Esther. I think Esther, you were there as well. Why don't you folks stand? And of course, Irwin's on the platform. Now, number 5 is where?
Number 5 is in Calgary.
In Calgary.
The missing one.
Okay, why don't you stand? Esther, come on, where's Albert? There we are. Let's give these folks a hand. There's a display out in the foyer about recounting the special history of these dear folks. I think Irwin's going to say a few things. We're going to have a video right now, a little bit of an introduction, and then we will turn the platform over to Dr. Erwin Lutzer, and we anticipate what God wants to say to us through our dear brother. Do the video, and we're off.
I am thankful. I'm thankful.
Still in love after all these years, a long-lasting couple shares their lifetime of memories. When Global National continues. Well, studies show more than half of all marriages end in divorce. Nobody told these two that. Why their love story is a lesson for all couples. Next. From a sprint to a marathon now. The enduring love story of a Regina couple celebrating a marriage that's lasted longer than most people are alive. Our Ross Neitz, married just a few years himself, getting their secrets on decades of wedded bliss.
So I'm going to help you up.
At 98 and 104 years old, Wanda and Gustav Lutzer know a thing or two about relationships. After all, they've been in one for quite a while.
We didn't know each other in the old country. We got to know each other here.
Prostrate at his feet.
Since 1931, the happy couple have been making beautiful music together. After immigrating to Canada separately from Europe, they found one another and settled down. This week, they celebrated their 76th anniversary.
What should I think? Only good things.
While Gustav and Wanda's relationship seems to have lasted forever, it all began in a flash. You see, Gustav proposed on one of their very first dates. Wanda said she needed some time.
I didn't expect it so quick, you know.
Only 3 days later, she had an answer. And 3 weeks after that, they were married, starting a love story that would stretch more than 70 years. When they began, they didn't have much. Over the years, they came to have what they wanted most: 5 children, 16 grandchildren, 36 great-grandchildren, and ultimately, each other.
We really had a good life together. That's why we live so long.
Today, age has taken its toll on the couple. Their daughter now cares for them in their home, and 6 months ago, Gustav began to retreat back into himself. He doesn't say much anymore, but today, he said this about his wife.
I am thankful. I'm thankful.
While their bodies have weakened and their hair grown gray, Wanda says their love has only grown stronger. Confirming her answer to an unexpected proposal was the best decision she ever made. Ross Neitz, Global News, Regina.
And that is Global National for Saturday. We're streaming this broadcast now on globalnational.com. I'm Tara Nelson. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Local news is next on most global stations.
Well, I would like to take this opportunity to say what a delight it is to be here and to connect again with my good friend, John Barkman, and his wife. John and I actually served together on the faculty of Briarcrest Bible College many years ago, just before the earth's crust hardened. That was a long time ago. So it's so great to be with you, John, and to see this marvelous ministry that God has here in the city of Regina, as the gospel goes out from this corner all over the city. Now, I do need to clarify, since my brothers and sisters are here, one sister who is actually the second member of the family. My oldest brother, Albert, who is the oldest, he stood a moment ago, and Ruth is in Calgary. But just to clarify, I need to point out that I am the youngest of the 5. Let that not be misunderstood. I looked into the mirror the other day and I said to my wife, I said, honey, I don't look 65, do I? She said, no, you don't, but you used to. Yeah. But it's so great to be here, and just a few words in a preliminary way, and that is that today, thanks to my brother, all those who come, and there's enough, I think, for one per family, will receive a free copy of my book, 1 Minute After You Die. God has seen fit to use the ministry of this book. So many stories. I mean, a daughter told me, my father will not allow this book to be on the shelf where he can see it because he doesn't want to think about death. Well, let me tell you today that denial is not just a river in Egypt, okay? Am I going too fast for you today? So you will have a free copy. Over 500,000 of these books have been sold. And then for sale are my latest book, When You've Been Wronged, just in case you have. It talks about spear throwers and people who are hard to get along with. And they all live in the United States, I discovered. My wife, by the way, is an American, and I have to tell you, I've also become an American. But she stood a moment ago. She doubles all of my joy, she halves my sorrows, and she triples my expenses, all right? And so these books are available for sale. And I was also on the John Gormley show this past week, and at least for a half an hour, and that also, I think, is available for a little bit of money. Now, John Barkman, and I hope it's okay that I call you John, even though I should be respectful, pastor, doctor, etc. He said to me, the only way you can speak here is if you give us a line or two of Billy Graham. Now, Billy, by the way, is in the hospital. I don't know if you know that. That was on the news yesterday. And when I was growing up here in Saskatchewan, I grew up in a little town in southern Saskatchewan that was so small that the mayor and the village idiot was the same person, okay? And when I was growing up, I would come home from church. This is serious. I'd come home from church and I would pretend that I was the preacher. There was something within me in those early days that told me my destiny did not lie on the farm. So I became, Billy Graham was my hero. Read everything I could about Billy. Eventually had the opportunity years later to attend a crusade and actually speak with him, but I'm going to give you a line or two as to how it might sound if Billy Graham were here today giving an invitation. Now, this is a younger Billy Graham, the way in which he would give invitations maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So with that background, this is the way in which it might sound. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to come, hundreds of you. You simply get up out of your seats and I want you to come. And for those of you who have joined us tonight by television, we'd like to send you some literature. We'd like to send you a book that has been a blessing to tens of thousands of people around the world, written by Pastor Lutzer. Just write to me, Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's all the address you need, just Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now until the same time next week, goodbye, and may the Lord bless you real good. Something like that. Well, as you know, we're here today to celebrate the life of my parents, and they can't be with us today. My father this month will be 105. My mother is 98 and will be 99 in November. And one of the things they would tell you at that age is for sure they have no peer pressure, okay? In fact, they've lived so long that I believe that their friends in heaven probably think that they just didn't make it. They are longing for heaven. Every time I talk to my mother on the phone, and I call her every Saturday, she says, are you praying that God will take us home? She says, you know, has he forgotten our number? In other words, has he forgotten about us? Well, someday they are going to be taken home, and what a memorial it would be. You know, when my dad was 100, my wife gave me a wonderful suggestion, as she often does. She said, why don't you get a blessing from your dad? In the Old Testament, they gave a blessing. So Dad was reading his Bible, and I went to him and I knelt beside his chair and I said, Dad, in the Old Testament, fathers gave their sons a blessing. Would you give me a blessing? Well, my friends, today, he took my head in both of his hands and prayed a prayer that would make heaven shake. I was trying to record it, and the recorder wasn't working. It was just beeping, and I felt so badly about that. I know I was supposed to be concentrating on the prayer, but I wanted to capture it. Listen, if you have a believing father who knows God, get a blessing from him. Ask him to bless you. And it'll be transforming. I was crying, he was crying. We embraced each other. When the time comes for him to go, everything will be okay. Everything has been looked after. But don't wait until your father's 100. There's a good chance that he might not make that. Well, today I am going to speak on the topic of the secrets of a happy marriage. But first of all, to rehearse just a little bit about my parents. They were born in the Ukraine because Russia had offered territory to Germans. So many Germans settled in the Ukraine. World War I breaks out in 1914. You see, what happened is Russia feared that the Germans within its borders might mutiny and side with Kaiser Wilhelm and the revival of the German Empire. So they made all of the Germans refugees. My father's family decided to go to Afghanistan because they thought that it would be warmer there, and it was. Unfortunately, there was also much disease there at the time. And so they went there. My father, at the age of 12, remember, born 1902, this is 1914, at the age of 12, lost 3 of his siblings within about 3 or 4 days, and then his mother, my grandmother, died at the age of 42. Paulina died of typhoid fever. No opportunity to say goodbye to her. She was whisked off to a hospital, and before the kids knew it, she had died. My father threw himself across the bed and wept. Here he was in a strange land. They were hungry. There was no food. He used to go with his mother to try to find food, and now his mother was dead. But in 1918, the war ended, and they were able to go back to their homestead, and from there, at the age of 25, he came to Canada. All of the other brothers and sisters stayed there because he was the only single one among the brothers at that time, and he had a relative in Weyburn, and so he made his way to Weyburn. Did Dad ever want to go back? Oh, he was so lonely, he cried himself to sleep, but he said that one thing is sure, he determined he would never go back to the old country, as it was called, because he saw a plow that you could sit on. Before that time, you always walked behind the horses, and you'd get so tired walking in the deep dirt. And now he could sit on a plow. He said, when I saw that seat, I said, I'm never going to go back. Now, my mother, much the same story. They were born, within 200 miles of each other, but did not meet each other in the Ukraine. She also became a refugee, and her father had to go to Siberia. But let me tell you this. 1913, the year before the war, her father comes to Chicago to prepare the way to bring the family to the United States. And he's in Chicago for a whole year working. And he wrote back and said, the buildings in Chicago are so tall that God must have built them. I wonder what he'd say if he were in Chicago now. And then World War I began to break out, and he had to get back to be with his family. But notice this, providentially, he got the last boat back to Europe that passengers could go on. After that, all boats were nothing but military men and equipment. And so he was able to be with the family from that critical time, 1914 to 1918. Now, how did they get to Siberia? Very difficult circumstances. We're skipping all that, how they had to go from one village to another and then Of course, you also had trains without facilities. They were put in boxcars, sometimes barges. Terrible stories. People died along the way and you just buried them and you kept going. But my mother came back also with her family then, and the two of them, that is my mother and also, yes, I was talking about my mother. My mother and her sister came to Canada. But I wanted to say this about her father. I wonder if when he was in Chicago that year, if he ever even thought, I'm sure he didn't, that someday within God's sovereign providence and undeserved grace, he would have a grandchild who would be a pastor in one of the cities in Chicago. I've had the privilege of being the pastor of the Moody Church for 28 years. But now we are in Canada. My father has been converted already in the Ukraine, having come to accept Christ as Savior. My mother comes to Canada wondering how to be born again. She was baptized Lutheran, but knew that that was not a ticket to heaven. And so she attends a little church and is working for a farmer that is quite close to the church, a half mile. And lo and behold, she hears the gospel and is gloriously converted. She overhears my father praying in the church. Now, in those days, the women sat on one side and the men on the other. And she thought, you know, he must be a godly man. He's the one then who asked her if he could walk her home the half mile, and on the way, first date, young people, this is not the way it's supposed to happen. He asks whether or not she would marry him. She said she'd have to think about it, but within 3 weeks, they were married. And that was 76 years ago. They got married without reading a single book by James Dobson. Without taking a seminar on marriage, they basically taught themselves to read, and that's the way in which it all began. Now, how come it lasted 76 years, and not only lasted 76 years, but lasted in a good way, not just tolerated, but a life of great difficulty, great sorrow, but also a life of enjoyment and fulfillment? What is the secret of a happy marriage and a lasting marriage? Now, I need to say that most people enter into marriage without understanding that there are various stages. The average person who goes into marriage is marrying a dream. They actually think that marriage is going to produce happiness, that God created this other person for them just so they would be happy. And then they discover that they aren't happy, and they go through that period of disillusionment. During the time of disillusionment, if they don't know how to handle conflict, finally they understand that they've married a person with all of his or her baggage, and it isn't exactly what they thought it was going to be. I mean, let me speak frankly. Getting married is something like getting a phone call in the middle of the night. First of all, you get a ring, and then you wake up. And then reality begins to dawn. And many couples at that point, what do? They begin to bail out. This isn't what I planned on. I expected to be happy. I'm not happy. This person is more difficult to live with, and I thought, I want out of here. But it's during that period of time you can go to the next stage, which is a period of development where finally you come to grips with who the other person is, and you begin to appreciate their differences, and you begin to realize that God brought this different person into your life to teach you lessons about yourself, your impatience, your anger, and your selfishness that you never even knew was there. And that's a period of discovery, period of development in the relationship. And then if you really want a happy marriage, you have to go to the next stage, and that is where you die to your own ambitions and you begin to live for the other person. Now, with that introduction, what I'd like to do is to give you 4 or 5 principles that guided the marriage of my parents, that are transforming, and if they guide your marriage and mine, we will discover that we too can have a lasting, permanent marriage until death do us part. Not debt, but death do us part. I'm reminded of Joshua in the Old Testament. He was preaching to a large crowd, and this was his conclusion. He said, you can either serve these gods, these false gods, or else, he says, you serve the Lord your God, but for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. All right, what does that look like? If you've not been taking notes until now, this would be a good time to begin. You might even want to use the offering envelope that should have been used for other purposes 15 minutes ago. Here are the principles. Number one, mutual commitment to the covenant. Mutual commitment to the covenant. They took their vows seriously. The Bible says that when you vow a vow unto the Lord, you should pay it, because God does not have pleasure in fools. So what you have is people who are committed to the covenant. It actually meant something. And that covenant meant more to them than their feelings, than their own happiness, than their own desire to have a better life, because a commitment is a commitment is a commitment. Now in the United States, and I'm sure it's here in Canada too, many people live without a covenant. They say to themselves, well, you know, I had somebody say, and he was living with his girlfriend, he said, you know, what's a piece of paper anyway? Well, I'll tell you what a piece of paper is. My wife and I, we purchased a house, I should say, in the Chicago area, and we sold it to very honorable people, and we are